To save my father's legacy, I had to destroy my family. The blueprints for the new city tower carried my father's name, a symbol of integrity I had revered my entire life. But as my eyes scanned the structural plans, I found it a familiar, dangerous shortcut buried deep in the concrete specifications, an engineering sin my father would have burned the company down to prevent. It was in that moment, staring at the ink of my uncle's betrayal, that I knew I had to finish the job for him. The heavy vellum of the blueprints unfurled across Arthur's desk with a soft, final sigh, filling his small municipal office with the scent of fresh ink and ambition. The logo in the bottom corner was a ghost from his childhood Blackwood construction, the typeface as bold and uncompromising as the man who had founded it. Arthur ran a hand over his tired face, the fluorescent lights overhead humming a monotonous tune. It had been 5 years since his father's funeral, and 2 since he had last spoken to his uncle Marcus at anything other than a strange holiday dinner. Yet, here was their new flagship project, the Olympus Tower, its schematics waiting for his red pen and official city stamp. He worked methodically, a habit ingrained by 2 decades of engineering and a disposition that favored certainty over speed. The foundation plans were solid, the geotechnical surveys thorough. He moved upward, section by section, tracing the load paths from the upper floors down to the bedrock. It was a clean design, elegant in its efficiency, very much in the style of the new architects Marcus had hired. Arthur felt a distant, hollow pain. His father's designs were never just efficient, they were over-engineered, built with a stubborn insistence on surviving the unimaginable. His pen paused on sheet S34, detailing the reinforcement schedule for the primary support columns from the lobby to the 20th floor. He scanned the specifications for the rebar cages, the steel skeletons that gave concrete its tensile strength. Grade 60 steel, 11 bars, it was all standard. Then he saw the note on lap splice placement. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He leaned closer, his breath fogging a small patch of the paper. The plans called for Type 1 lap splices in a region designated as a potential plastic hinge zone. It was a technical detail, one that 100 other inspectors might skim over, but to Arthur, it was a scream. In an earthquake, those points were designed to flex, to absorb the seismic energy that would otherwise shatter the building. Using a Type 1 splice there, a simple overlapping of rebar, instead of a more robust mechanical coupler or a Type 2 tension splice, was like replacing the bones in a fighter's hand with chalk. It saved a fortune in material and labor. It also guaranteed catastrophic failure in the exact kind of seismic event this city was built to withstand. He pushed his chair back, the wheels groaning in protest. It couldn't be. A typo, an engineer's oversight, a draft that slipped through review. He thumbed through the thick stack of pages, his movements now sharp and urgent, and pulled the material specification sheet. The order was right there in black and white, a calculated decision, quantified and approved. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was 16, spending a summer on a job site, the air thick with the smell of dust and welding fumes. His father, a titan in a hard hat, held 2 pieces of rebar in his massive hands. He was dressing down a subcontractor who had tried to pull the same trick. "You think this is just steel?" His father's voice had boomed across the concrete floor, a sound that made men twice his size flinch. "This is the skeleton. This is what lets a family on the 30th floor sleep at night. You don't cut corners on the skeleton. Ever." He had never forgotten it. That principle was the cornerstone of Blackwood construction, the moral bedrock upon which his father had built an empire. And Marcus had just dynamited it. Arthur stared at the signature block at the bottom of the blueprint. Marcus Blackwood, President. His cousin, Leo Blackwood, Project Manager. This wasn't a mistake. This was a philosophy. A rock that had set in at the heart of his father's legacy, deliberately injected into the concrete and steel that bore his name. The red inspection pen in Arthur's hand felt impossibly heavy, no longer a tool of civic duty, but a weapon waiting to be aimed. Sleep offered no refuge. The image of the flawed splice was seared onto the back of Arthur's eyelids, a symbol of decay blooming in his family's foundations. He abandoned his bed before dawn, the silence of his apartment amplifying the hum of dread in his veins. He couldn't just reject the plans that would trigger a review, a slap on the wrist for his uncle, and a quiet resubmission. It would trim the branch but leave the root of the rod untouched. He needed to understand how deep it went. His father's house had been kept just as had left it, a shrine of leather and oak that Arthur rarely had the strength to visit. That morning, he let himself in with his old key, the air inside still and heavy with the scent of pipe tobacco and aged paper. He went straight to the study. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of morning light slanting through the blinds. On the massive desk, his father's reading glasses still rested beside a 5-year-old copy of the engineering news record. Arthur's chest tightened. He was no longer a son visiting a memory, he was an investigator excavating a tomb. He started with the private ledgers, the ones his father kept separate from the official company books. For hours, Arthur sat in the worn leather chair, tracing his father's precise, angular handwriting. The numbers were clean, almost frustratingly so. Then, in the final volume, dated the year of his death, the pattern shifted. Small things, easily missed. A series of payments to a consulting firm Arthur had never heard of, Apex Strategic Solutions. A transfer to a holding company with a vague memo, Project Phoenix Due Diligence. These weren't the familiar names of suppliers or subcontractors. They were whispers in the margins, aberrations in a lifetime of meticulous record keeping. They all occurred within the last 6 months of his father's life. The paper trail was a ghost, hinting at a presence but offering no form. He needed a voice. There was only one man his father trusted more than his own brother, Samuel Petrov, the site foreman who had started with Blackwood Construction on its very first job and retired the day after the funeral. Arthur found Samuel in his garden, kneeling over a bed of stubborn weeds, his hands, though wrinkled, still thick and powerful. He looked up as Arthur approached, his gaze clear and direct. He didn't smile, but a warmth softened his weathered features. "Arthur. It's been too long." "Samuel. I'm sorry to bother you." "You're never a bother," the old man said, rising slowly, his knees cracking. "You have your father's eyes. Especially when something's weighing on you." Inside, over cups of strong, black coffee, Arthur laid out his concerns, speaking not of blueprints and spices, but of a feeling. He spoke of the company's new direction, of a departure from the old ways. Samuel listened patiently, his hands wrapped around his mug, his silence a deep well of knowledge. When Arthur finished, Samuel stared into his cup for a long moment. He was worried, he finally said, his voice a low rumble. "The last year he wasn't himself. Your uncle, Marcus, he has a silver tongue. He talked of aggressive growth, of competing in a new market. Your father called it what it was, gambling." Samuel leaned forward, the intensity in his eyes bridging the years. They fought. Not arguments you could hear through the walls. These were cold wars, fought in the boardroom. Marcus wanted to use cheaper suppliers, faster methods. He'd bring in these consultants, young men in sharp suits who had never poured a yard of concrete in their lives. Your father would throw them out. But Marcus would just bring in new ones. He shook his head, a look of profound sadness crossing his face. It wore him down, Arthur. He told me once, "Sam, he's trying to strip the engine while the car is still moving." He was fighting to protect the name on the door, and it was breaking his heart. Driving away from Samuel's quiet suburban street, the pieces locked into place with chilling precision. The flawed blueprint wasn't an act of post-mortem greed. It was the final victory in a long, silent coup. His father's sudden heart attack no longer seemed like a simple tragedy of health. It felt like the final casualty of a war Arthur never even knew he was fighting. Samuel's words echoed in Arthur's mind, giving a grim shake to the financial ghosts in his father's ledgers. He now possessed two ends of a thread, a dangerous engineering shortcut and a history of internal conflict, but the middle was a black box, locked away inside the Blackwood Construction servers. He couldn't keystorm the castle. He needed a key. He needed someone on the inside. His thoughts turned to a name he hadn't considered in years: Elena Morales. His father had taken a chance on her straight out of state college, impressed by her fierce intelligence and quiet integrity. He mentored her personally, often praising her at the dinner table. "That girl can see the story behind the numbers," he used to say. "She's got an honest mind." An honest mind, Arthur hoped, was something Marcus couldn't corrupt. Reaching out was a delicate operation. A call to her desk would be logged. An email would leave a digital footprint. He waited until the end of the workday, parking his unremarkable sedan across the street from the Blackwood Tower, and watched the river of employees flow out onto the evening streets. When he saw Elena, her head down, a briefcase in one hand, he got out and intercepted her path near the corner, creating an encounter that could pass for coincidence. "Elena?" She looked up, startled. Recognition dawned, followed immediately by a flicker of fear. In the new Blackwood regime, the disinherited son of the founder was likely poison. "Arthur. What are you doing here?" Her voice was hushed, her eyes darting toward the building's entrance as if Marcus himself might materialize. "I was hoping I could talk to you for a minute." "Privately," he said, his tone low and even. "There's a coffee shop a few blocks away." "Please." She hesitated, her mind visibly calculating the risk. The plea in his eyes, a reflection of his father's, must have tipped the scales. She gave a single, terse nod. In the anonymous warmth of the cafe, they sat at a small table in the back. For a moment, neither spoke. The air was thick with unspoken history and present danger. Elena clutched her coffee cup as if it were a shield. "I know this is a massive risk for you," Arthur began, deciding that directness was the only path. "I wouldn't be here if it wasn't critical." "What is this about?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Instead of answering, Arthur pulled a folded document from his jacket. It was a copy of Sheet S-34, the section with the flawed splice specification circled in red. He pushed it across the table. Elena, an accountant, stared at the complex engineering diagram with a confused frown. "I don't understand," she said. "You don't have to," Arthur replied, his voice flat with contained gravity. "This is a plan to build a 40-story building with a fatal structural flaw. It saves money up front. In a seismic event, it guarantees collapse. My father's name is on that building, but his principles aren't in it." Elena's eyes widened as she absorbed the implication. The professional jargon was meaningless, but the words fatal and collapse were universal. She looked from the paper back to Arthur, the fear in her eyes now mixed with dawning horror. "Your father," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "he taught me that every number in a ledger has a real-world consequence. A misplaced decimal could be a missing shipment of steel, a delayed paycheck for a worker's family. He said the numbers had to be honest because the work had to be honest. And it's not," Arthur said. "I think Marcus has been betraying that principle for a long time, even before my father died." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I need to prove it. I need to know what the numbers say now." She looked down at her hands, then back at the blueprint. He could see the war raging within her, the instinct for self-preservation against the pull of loyalty and ethics. To help him would be to commit career suicide, possibly worse. But to refuse would be to sanction the very corruption her mentor had taught her to despise. After a long, agonizing silence, she slid the blueprint back toward him. "Last quarter," she said, her voice so low he had to lean in to hear. "We had to write off a huge shipment of grade 80 rebar as damaged in transit. But there was never a damage report. A week later, a new invoice came through for grade 60 from a different supplier, one I've never heard of. Apex Materials." Arthur's blood ran cold. Apex. The same name from his father's private ledger. It wasn't just a ghost anymore. It was a vendor. It was real. "I can't promise you'll be safe, Elena," Arthur said honestly. She met his gaze, the fear still there but now forged into resolve. Your father gave me a career when no one else would. He taught me to do the right thing, especially when it's hard. Tell me what you need. Their system was a low-tech dance of high-stakes espionage. Every few days, Elena would leave the office and drop a thick manila envelope into a specific public mailbox on her route to the subway. An hour later, Arthur would retrieve it. There were no calls, no texts, just a silent, steady stream of information flowing from the corrupted heart of Blackwood Construction into his hands. Each envelope he opened in the stark privacy of his apartment felt like another shovel of dirt removed from a crime scene. Elena was more than just a source, she was a brilliant analyst. She didn't just send random files. She sent stories told in spreadsheets and invoices. The first packet laid the groundwork, confirming his initial suspicions. It contained the original purchase order for the high-grade steel for the Olympus Tower, followed by the cancellation notice and a new order from Apex Materials at a 30% discount. Tucked behind it was a chemical analysis report from a new supplier, a document so riddled with boilerplate language and missing certifications that it was practically transparent. The second envelope went deeper. Elena had dug into Apex Materials and the other mysterious consultant from his father's ledgers, Apex Strategic Solutions. They were shell corporations, both registered to a P.O. box in a state with lax corporate disclosure laws. The payments, however, didn't stay there. Elena had followed the money, cross-referencing routing numbers with expense reports. The trail led to a series of offshore accounts, and from there, to very tangible domestic purchases, a down payment on a yacht for his cousin Leo, a new beachfront property for his uncle Marcus. They weren't just cutting corners to keep the company afloat. They were siphoning its lifeblood to fund the lifestyle his father had always condemned as wasteful and vulgar. Each document was a betrayal written in ink. Falsified concrete strength tests. Invoices for safety equipment that was never delivered to job sites. Overtime payments for ghost employees. It was a systematic deconstruction of his father's ethos, a conversion of his legacy into cash. Arthur spread the documents across his dining room table, the sheer volume of the fraud creating a mosaic of greed. The most damning evidence arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening. The envelope was heavier than usual. Inside was a stack of printed emails, all from a private server Marcus and Leo used for sensitive communications. Elena had found a password scribbled in an old notebook in a senior executive's desk who had been recently, and suddenly, retired. Arthur read the emails under the single cone of light from his desk lamp. The clinical language of finance was gone, replaced by the casual cruelty of thieves who believed they were untouchable. Father, one email from Leo read, the city inspector on the 12th Street site is asking about the girder sourcing. He's one of the old guard, new grandfather. Should I be concerned? Marcus' reply was chillingly dismissive. The old guard is a dying breed. Send him a gift basket and a copy of the doctored certifications. Hell make his noise and then hell go away. They always do. Your grandfather built this company on strength, we're rebuilding it on speed. The future doesn't have time for his sentimentality. Arthur felt a cold fury rise in his chest, a rage so pure and clean it felt like a whetstone sharpening his resolve. This wasn't just about a flawed building or stolen money. It was a desecration. They had taken his father's memory, his life's work, and twisted it into a monument to their own avarice. They had mistaken his father's integrity for weakness, his principles for sentimentality. He looked at the paper trail of rot covering his table, and for the first time, he saw not just evidence of a crime, but the blueprint for their undoing. Just when Arthur thought he had mapped the full extent of the decay, Elena sent the one document he never could have anticipated. It wasn't in a manila envelope. She had requested an urgent, in-person meeting, the first since their initial conversation, her voice strained over a payphone. They met on a windswept park bench after dark, the city lights a cold, indifferent audience. She handed him a single, folded sheaf of papers, her hand trembling. This was in your father's private office safe, she whispered. Marcus had the whole office renovated last year, but they just left the safe. I found the combination in an old company directory. Arthur unfolded the document under the weak glow of a park lamp. It was a revised partnership agreement for Blackwood Construction. The legalese was dense, but the intent was brutally clear. It restructured the company ownership, dissolving his father's majority stake into a complex trust. Upon his death, operational control would pass entirely to Marcus, and Arthur's own inheritance was reduced to a token, non-voting share, effectively writing him out of his own birthright. The date on the document was 3 weeks before his father died. His father's signature was on the last page. It was shaky, a pale imitation of his usual confident script, but it looked genuine. Then Arthur saw the second signature, the one on the witness line. The clean, looping cursive was as familiar to him as his own reflection. Clara Blackwood. His sister. The world seemed to fall away, the sounds of the city traffic fading to a dull roar in his ears. The fraud, the greed, the emails, all of it had been a betrayal by his uncle, an enemy he had long understood. This was different. This was a wound from within, a knife in the back from the one person he thought he could trust implicitly. Clara, who had cried on his shoulder at the funeral. Clara, who had always been his ally against their father's impossible standards. Her signature was the ink of a betrayal so profound it redrew the map of his entire life. He drove to her suburban home in a state of cold, detached shock. She opened the door, a welcoming smile on her face that died the moment she saw his expression. He didn't say a word, just walked past her into the living room and placed the document on her coffee table. She stared at it, the color draining from her face. The silence stretched, filled only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. When she finally looked up, her eyes were swimming in a mixture of shame and terror. "Arthur," she started, her voice breaking. "Just tell me why, Clara," he said, his own voice unnervingly calm. "He was your father, too." The story came out in a torrent of sobs and fractured sentences. It wasn't about greed. It was about fear. A few months before their father's death, Clara's husband had made a disastrous series of trades, losing their life savings and racking up an enormous, undeclared debt to a very unforgiving lender. Marcus had found out. He didn't offer help, he offered a transaction. He would make the debt disappear. In return, she would help him convince their ailing father to sign the new agreement, and she would bear witness to it. "He told me Dad was already fading," she cried, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "He said the stress of the company was killing him, and this was the only way to protect it. He said you didn't want the business anyway, that you were happy in your city job. He made it sound like a kindness." She looked down at her hands, unable to meet his eyes. "And the debt, Arthur, they were threatening us. They knew where the kids went to school." Marcus had isolated her, preying on her desperation and her love for her family, twisting her into a tool for his own ambition. He had used her secret as a key to unlock their father's legacy. Arthur listened, the cold fury in his chest slowly being replaced by a vast, hollow ache. His sister wasn't a co-conspirator. She was a hostage. A victim of the same rot that was poisoning the company, another piece of collateral damage in Marcus's silent war. But the signature was still there. The betrayal was still real. The family he thought he had, the one he was fighting to protect, was already a ruin. Leaving his sister's house, Arthur felt none of the righteous anger he had anticipated. There was only the cold, clear weight of understanding. This was no longer just about his father's company or his own stolen inheritance. It was about a conspiracy that had preyed on the weak, endangered the public, and shattered his family from the inside out. The rage he had felt reading Marcus' emails had cooled and hardened into something more dangerous purpose. He was no longer just uncovering a crime, he was engineering its consequences. His dining room table, once a chaotic collage of evidence, now became a war room. He met with Elena, not in secret cafes, but in the neutral territory of a university library's private study room. Together, they transformed the raw data of her findings into an unassailable narrative of corruption. They built a fortress of facts, meticulously organized into a single, comprehensive dossier. Every falsified invoice was paired with its legitimate counterpart. Every payment to a shell corporation was traced, step by step, to a luxury purchase. The damning emails from Marcus and Leo were compiled into a timeline that corresponded precisely with the fraudulent activities. They included a sworn, notarized affidavit from Elena, detailing her discoveries and the methods she used to obtain them, a courageous act that transformed her from a source into a whistleblower. The final pages were dedicated to the Olympus Tower blueprints, with Arthur's own expert analysis attached, a clear, concise explanation of the structural flaw, its potential for catastrophic failure, and the public danger it represented. The dossier was a weapon, forged in the fires of betrayal and meticulously machined for a single, devastating impact. But a weapon was useless without a hand to wield it. A quiet report to the authorities would get buried in bureaucracy. A lawsuit would drag on for years, allowing Marcus to bleed the company dry in legal fees. Arthur needed to detonate the evidence in a way that would guarantee an immediate and overwhelming reaction. He needed public outrage. He needed the media. He called Samuel Petrov. The old foreman had been his father's rock, and now he would serve as Arthur's. He didn't ask for details of the investigation, only what Arthur needed. "I need a journalist," Arthur said over the phone. "Not just any reporter. Someone with a spine of steel, who can't be bought or intimidated. Someone who understands the difference between a building and a home." Samuel was silent for a moment. "There's a woman," he said finally. "Isabel Vance. She did a series on construction fraud a few years back that took down 2 major developers. She's relentless. And she knew your father. Respected him. I'll make a call, but I won't use your name. I'll just tell her I have a story about a ghost she used to admire." The meeting with Isabel Vance took place in a sterile, anonymous hotel room. She was sharp, her eyes missing nothing, her questions precise and surgical. She listened without interruption as Arthur laid out the entire story, from the flawed blueprint to his sister's coerced signature. He then slid the dossier across the table. She spent the next hour reading, her expression unreadable. She cross-referenced names, checked dates, and occasionally made a small note in a leather-bound journal. When she finally looked up, her gaze was hard. "This is dynamite, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice devoid of sensationalism. "But the personal part, your sister, the inheritance, that's a family drama. The real story, the one I'll burn this city down with, is this." She tapped the Olympus Tower blueprint. "Public endangerment. Corporate malfeasance. That's the kill shot." "I'm not interested in a family drama," Arthur replied, his voice steady. "I'm interested in justice. The kind my father believed in." "Good," she said, a flicker of something like Samuel's respect in her eyes. "Because if what's in this file is true, justice is exactly what's coming. Now, tell me about your uncle's shareholder meeting next month." The blueprint for Marcus' ruin was now complete. All that was left was to lay the foundation. The final phase of Arthur's plan required him to step out of the shadows and back into his official role. It was the one piece of leverage he had that Marcus could neither anticipate nor control: the impartial authority of the city. He spent a week meticulously laying the bureaucratic groundwork, ensuring every form was filed, every justification documented. He built a case for a snap audit on the Olympus Tower, citing anonymous industry chatter and procedural red flags he himself had planted within the permit review system. It was a Trojan horse constructed from paperwork and sealed with the city's official crest. His boss, a weary veteran of city politics named Henderson, barely looked up from his desk when Arthur submitted the final request. "Blackwood Construction. That's your family's company, isn't it?" "It is," Arthur said, his voice level. "Which is why I need another senior inspector on the team. He'll lead the structural analysis, but I want every finding double verified. By the book, no exceptions." Henderson grunted, appeased by the appearance of professional detachment. He signed the order. Don't make a mess, Blackwood. I only intend to find one, Arthur replied. The timing was everything. Elena had confirmed the date and time of the annual Blackwood shareholder meeting. It was to be a grand affair held in the ballroom of a downtown hotel, a celebration of record profits and expansion. Marcus and Leo would be on stage, selling their vision of a faster, more profitable future to investors and city dignitaries. It was the perfect stage for their downfall. Arthur scheduled his random inspection for exactly 1 hour after the meeting was set to begin. The morning of the audit, Arthur felt a strange calm settle over him. He pulled on his steel-toed boots, his high-visibility vest, and his hard hat. He was no longer a grieving son or a vengeful brother. He was an instrument of the city, an agent of the codes his father had taught him to respect. He met the other inspector, a by-the-book engineer named Davies, at the construction site. Leo was there to meet them, his face a mask of practiced affability that barely concealed his irritation. Arthur. This is a surprise. Everything's on schedule. You could have just called. It's a spot audit, Leo, Arthur said, his tone clipped and official. Well, try to stay out of your crew's way. I've already sent a list of the core samples and inspection points we'll need access to. The list was not random. Guided by the documents Elena had provided, it was a precise map of the project's hidden sins. He had targeted the exact columns where the substandard rebar had been used, the sections of the foundation poured with weakened concrete, and the structural welds that had been signed off on but never completed. He wasn't on a fishing expedition. He was collecting specimens he already knew were there. For 3 hours, they worked under Leo's increasingly anxious gaze. Davies, a man who found a quiet joy in procedural compliance, was grim-faced. The ultrasonic scanner revealed voids in the concrete. The core samples they drilled were visibly inadequate, crumbling at pressures well below specification. Using a portable metal analyzer, Arthur tested the rebar in a partially completed column. The display flashed grade 60. Exactly as the fraudulent invoices had specified, and fatally insufficient for the load it was meant to bear. Each failed test was meticulously documented, photographed, and countersigned by Davies, whose initial professional curiosity had morphed into cold anger. He was a city inspector, and this was an affront to his entire profession. This is criminal, Davies muttered, looking at the readings on the analyzer. Yes, Arthur said. It is. As they packed their equipment, Arthur checked his watch. The shareholder meeting would be at its peak, Marcus likely basking in a round of applause. He pulled out his phone and made 2 calls. The first was a text to Isabel Vance. Showtime. The second was a call to the Department of Buildings Enforcement Division. This is Inspector Blackwood, he said, his voice ringing with the full authority of his office. I'm on site at the Olympus Tower. I'm issuing an immediate stop work order, effective now. The site is to be sealed pending a full structural review. This building represents a clear and present danger to public safety. He looked over at Leo, whose face had gone pale. The Trojan horse had been opened, and the city's true power was about to pour out. In the gilded ballroom of the Grand Excelsior Hotel, Marcus Blackwood was at the peak of his power. He stood at a polished mahogany lectern, bathed in a warm spotlight, a portrait of confident leadership. Behind him, a massive screen displayed a graph of skyrocketing profits. The audience, a carefully curated mix of shareholders, banking executives, and city council members, was captivated, hanging on his every word about a streamlined, modernized, and relentlessly profitable Blackwood construction. His son, Leo, sat in the front row, a prince awaiting his coronation, beaming with pride. My brother built this company on a foundation of strength, Marcus said, his voice smooth and resonant, a masterful blend of feigned reverence and forward-looking ambition. We honor that legacy by building on it, by adapting it for a new century. We have cut inefficiencies, embraced innovation, and delivered returns that were once thought impossible. He was in the middle of a sentence about future expansion when a subtle shift occurred in the room. It began not as a sound, but as a ripple of light. One by one, the faces in the audience were illuminated by the blue glow of their cell phones. A low murmur started at the back of the room and spread like a contagion, growing from a confused whisper to an audible buzz of alarm. Marcus faltered, his practiced smile tightening. He squinted into the crowd, trying to understand the sudden break in their rapt attention. It was then that the ballroom doors at the rear swung open. Two uniformed city enforcement officers entered, their presence an immediate and jarring violation of the corporate decorum. They were followed by a stern-faced official from the Department of Buildings, who held a large, bright red placard. They walked with purpose down the central aisle, their heavy work boots silent on the plush carpet. The murmuring in the room died instantly, replaced by a tense, expectant hush. The official did not wait to be acknowledged. He walked directly to the stage, mounted the small set of stairs, and stood beside the lectern. He unrolled the placard and held it up for all to see. In bold, black letters, it read "Stop Work Order." Marcus Blackwood, the official announced, his voice amplified by the microphone, sharp and devoid of courtesy. By order of the City Department of Buildings, all work on the Olympus Tower project is to cease immediately. A full structural audit has revealed critical and willful violations of the city building code, constituting a grave and imminent threat to public safety. A collective gasp swept through the audience. Marcus stared at the sign, his face a frozen mask of disbelief. Before he could formulate a response, the second wave of Arthur S. attack hit. At that exact moment, every phone that had lit up in the room received a push alert from every major news outlet in the city. Isabel Vance's article had gone live. The headline was "Devastating City Halts Blackwood Tower Leaked Docs Reveal Widespread Fraud, Public Endangerment Scheme." The story was a masterpiece of controlled demolition. It laid out the entire conspiracy, supported by scans of the falsified invoices, excerpts from the damning emails, and a link to Arthur's full, unassailable structural analysis. It named Marcus and Leo directly, detailing their use of shell corporations and their siphoning of company funds. It was a kill shot, delivered with journalistic precision, turning a room of investors into a room of victims. Panic erupted. The buzz of alarm became a roar of outrage. Shareholders were on their feet, shouting questions. Bankers were furiously thumbing through the article on their phones, their faces aghast. The city council members, who had been lauding Marcus just minutes before, now looked at him as if he were a leper, quickly creating distance between themselves and the imploding stage. Marcus stood speechless, the spotlight that had illuminated his triumph now a harsh interrogator's lamp. He looked out at the chaos, his empire crumbling in real time. His gaze fell on Leo, who was staring at his phone, his face the color of ash. Their eyes met across the ruined landscape of their ambition. There was no defiance, no plan. There was only the silent, shared understanding that they were utterly and completely finished. The hammers of justice, unseen and unheard until that very moment, had finally fallen. The coordinated strike of Arthur's inspection report and Isabel Vance's exposé created a shockwave that did not dissipate. It amplified. The story was no longer just a local scandal, it was national news, a textbook case of corporate greed endangering public lives. The district attorney, sensing a high-profile case with overwhelming public support, acted with a speed rarely seen in civic government. Less than 48 hours after the disastrous shareholder meeting, the DA announced the formation of a special task force to investigate Blackwood construction. Arthur, in his capacity as the primary city inspector, spent 2 full days with investigators, walking them through his findings. He handed over his meticulously organized dossier, which now served as the prosecution's roadmap. Elena, granted immunity for her cooperation, did the same with the financial records, her testimony providing the crucial context for the paper trail of shell corporations and offshore accounts. They were no longer conspirators in the shadows, they were the state's star witnesses. The arrests came at dawn the following Friday. News helicopters hovered over Marcus' opulent waterfront estate as plainclothes detectives led him out in handcuffs. He looked smaller without his tailored suit, a diminished figure blinking in the sudden glare of the camera flashes. A separate team picked up Leo at his downtown penthouse, a building his grandfather had ironically built 2 decades earlier. The images were on every channel, the architects of a modern, efficient empire brought low by the simple, old-fashioned mechanics of the law. The legal assault was swift and comprehensive. Citing the overwhelming evidence of fraud and the flight risk posed by their offshore assets, the judge denied bail. The DAS office immediately moved to freeze every known asset tied to Marcus, Leo, and a network of shell corporations. The yacht, the beachfront property, the luxury cars, all were seized as proceeds of crime. The financial engine of their lavish lifestyle sputtered and died overnight. For Blackwood Construction, the company itself, the result was a death sentence. The stop work order on the Olympus Tower was just the beginning. Clients, terrified of the liability and reputational damage, began pulling out of contracts en masse. Banks rescinded lines of credit. Subcontractors filed liens for unpaid work, and a flood of civil lawsuits from investors and shareholders threatened to drown what little remained of the company's assets. The Blackwood name, once a symbol of unshakable integrity, was now synonymous with fraud. Arthur watched the collapse from a distance, a silent observer of the demolition he had engineered. There was no triumph, no sense of victory. He felt only a profound and hollow sadness. Every news report that celebrated the takedown of a corrupt CEO was also an obituary for his father's life's work. He saw the company's logo, his family's name, dragged through the mud and knew that it could never be clean again. He had set out to save his father's legacy, but in order to excise the cancer, had to burn the entire body to ash. The company his father had poured his soul into was gone, reduced to a cautionary tale on the evening news and a tangle of lawsuits in a bankruptcy court. With the public storm raging around the smoldering ruins of Blackwood Construction, Arthur turned to face the private wreckage. His sister Clara had left him a dozen frantic, tearful voicemails. He didn't answer them. Instead, he drove back to her house, the same one where he had confronted her, feeling like a general surveying a battlefield of his own making. She met him at the door, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed from days of crying. There were no accusations, no anger. There was only the quiet, devastating weight of their shared ruin. "Is it true?" she whispered. "Everything they're saying about Marcus?" "The building." "Yes," Arthur said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's all true." They sat in her living room, the silence punctuated by the distant sound of her children playing in the yard, blissfully unaware that their family had been fractured beyond repair. "The DAS office called," Clara said, her voice hollow. "They want me to testify. About the partnership agreement." She looked at him, her gaze a desperate plea for an absolution he couldn't give. "What do I do, Arthur?" This was the moment he had been dreading, the point where justice and family collided with brutal force. He could have condemned her, reminded her of the signature that had nearly cost him everything. But looking at her, he saw not a villain, but another victim caught in the gears of Marcus' greed. "You tell them the truth," he said. "All of it. About the debt, about the threats, about how Marcus coerced you." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "This is the name of a good lawyer. He's not cheap, but he's honest. He'll cover the cost." Clara stared at the card, then at him, fresh tears welling in her eyes. "Why?" "After what I did." "Because you're my sister," Arthur said, the words costing him more than any legal fee ever could. "What you did was wrong. You were a participant. But you were also a victim. You deserve a fair process, not to be ground under by Marcus' fall." This wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was something more difficult, a clear-eyed acknowledgement of the painful, messy truth of their situation. He was offering a lifeline, not an escape. He left her with the lawyer's card and a chasm of unspoken grief between them. The family dinners, the shared holidays, the easy comfort of their shared history, all of it felt like a distant country to which he could never return. Later that week, seeking a different kind of solace, he drove to Samuel Petrov's house. The old foreman was in his workshop, planing a piece of dark cherry wood, the scent of sawdust a clean and honest perfume. Samuel set down his tool as Arthur entered and gestured to a stool. He had already heard everything, of course. "It's done," Arthur said, the two words carrying the weight of the entire ordeal. "The company is gone." Samuel nodded slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. A building with a rotten foundation has to be torn down before it collapses on its own. "You didn't destroy it, Arthur. You just exposed the rot that was already there." "It was Dad's life's work," Arthur said, the loss raw in his voice. "No," Samuel corrected him, his gaze unwavering. "His life's work wasn't the company. The company was just the container. His work was the quality, the integrity. The refusal to cut corners on the skeleton. That was his legacy. And you saved it." He picked up a carpenter's square from his workbench, its right angle perfect and true. "Marcus and Leo, they tried to bend this. They tried to say it could be 85 degrees and still be strong. You came along and proved that a right angle is a right angle, and anything else is a lie. That's what your father would be proud of." The old man's words were a balm on a wound Arthur hadn't known how to treat. The victory was still somber, the cost still immense. But for the first time, he understood that he hadn't just been an agent of destruction. He had been a conservator of the one thing that truly mattered, the unshakable truth his father had built his life on. A year passed. The wheels of justice turned slowly but inexorably. Marcus and Leo, faced with an ironclad case, accepted a plea deal. They were convicted of felony fraud and reckless endangerment, their sentences ensuring they would spend the prime of their lives in prison. Clara's testimony, painting a vivid picture of coercion and fear, earned her probation and community service. The Blackwood name was now a permanent fixture in the city's annals of corporate crime. Arthur resigned from his city inspector position. He could no longer be an impartial arbiter when his own actions had reshaped the industry's landscape. For months, he lived quietly, using his diminished inheritance to ensure Elena, who had moved to another state to start fresh, was financially secure. He walked, he read, he sat with the silence of his hollowed-out life. He had won. The public was safe, the criminals were punished, and his father's principles had been vindicated. Yet, the victory felt like standing alone in the ashes of a home that had to be burned. But the impulse that drove his father, the need to build things that last, was in his blood. He couldn't let his father's true legacy remain buried under the rubble of the company that bore his name. He used what was left of his inheritance to start again, not with a construction empire, but with an idea. He opened a small, two-room office and founded the Blackwood Integrity Group, a specialized engineering consultancy focused on one thing: third-party structural audits and ethical building oversight. His mission wasn't to build towers, but to ensure that the towers others built were true. His first employee was Samuel Petrov, who, bored with retirement, agreed to come on as a senior advisor. They didn't need a flashy logo or a marketing budget. Arthur's name, now ironically, was his greatest asset. In the wake of the scandal, developers and banks were terrified of liability. They needed a seal of approval that was beyond reproach, and the man who had torn down his own family's company to expose a flaw was the new gold standard for integrity. 6 months after opening their doors, a consortium of banks and insurance companies, now the reluctant owners of the half-finished Olympus Tower, approached him. The shell of the building stood as a monument to his family's failure, a concrete skeleton haunting the city skyline. They didn't want him to tear it down. They wanted him to fix it. They offered him the contract to oversee the remediation, to design and supervise the costly, complex, and public process of making the building safe. Arthur accepted without hesitation. His first day on the job, he stood on the dusty concrete floor of the tower's lobby, the same space where the flawed columns stood. The work ahead was immense. Entire sections of the structure would need to be surgically reinforced, the substandard steel replaced, the weak concrete chipped out and repaired. It would cost millions and take years. It was an engineering penance. He ran his hand over the rough surface of a column, the very same one where his investigation had begun. This was not the legacy his father had intended, but it was the one that had been left to him. He could not rebuild the family, nor could he resurrect the old company. But here, in the heart of his uncle's greatest crime, he could build something new. He could take this symbol of corruption and, piece by painstaking piece, transform it into a testament to the enduring strength of the truth. This was his purpose now. Not a glorious campaign of justice, but the quiet, methodical work of rebuilding. He would establish a new legacy, one that didn't carry the weight of a corporate empire, but was founded on something far stronger, the simple, unbending cornerstone of his father's convictions. It all began with a single, flawed line on a blueprint, a quiet betrayal in black and white. Arthur's journey reminds us that true justice isn't about the roar of victory, but about the solemn, difficult work of rebuilding on a foundation of truth. In the end, he didn't just save a building, he honored the man who taught him what it meant to build something that could truly last, even if he had to tear everything else down to do it. We hope Arthur's story stayed with you. Here at Content Channel, we believe the best narratives are the ones that make us question our own choices. With that in mind, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Considering the intense coercion she was under and the depth of her betrayal, was Arthur right to offer his sister Clara legal support? Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you for the next story. We'll find out what happens when a loyal employee, who thought she escaped to a new life, discovers the rot from her old company has roots in her new town.